Ever since I was a kid, I have just always been weirdly fascinated by asylums. And now I'm not talking about the cheesy haunted house version with ghost hunters whispering into drywall stains like the building owes them answers. Don't get me wrong, those shows, those movies, they are so much fun. I could binge watch them all weekend long. But what I'm talking about today is the real history behind these places because they didn't start out as what they turned into. They were supposed to represent compassion and safety, treatment, a refuge for people that society just didn't seem to understand. But somehow they kind of evolved into some of the most disturbing institutions in human history. That transformation has always haunted me. But it's not just because the treatments were so horrific or the terrible stories that came out of them. Really, it's about the core of it all, how quickly human beings can just dehumanize other people once they label them as crazy or unstable, difficult, different, or just others. See, history has shown us over and over again that once society stops seeing people as actual people, they can justify doing almost anything to them. And that's one of the things that kind of drove me to create my channel, The Ninth File. I like to dig into that dark history, those unsolved mysteries, some of the weird things like cults and conspiracies, true crime, all those dark corners that a lot of humans would just rather leave unlit. So if that's your kind of nightmare, I hope you'll subscribe and let me know in the comments what historical topics creep you out the most. All right, get ready, because we're going to take a stroll through the asylums. Picture this. The year is 1887, and maybe you're crying just like a little bit too much post-childbirth, or maybe you argued with your husband one time too many, or you might just be a little bit too outspoken for that particular era. The next thing you know, you are being hauled off somewhere where you're diagnosed with something called female hysteria, and then you're sent to an asylum where your treatment plan might include things like ice baths, isolation, forced labor, and doctors whose confidence is doing way more heavy lifting than their actual knowledge. Basically, it is 19th century medicine at its most reassuring. Welcome to the history of mental health care. It is where medicine, religion, fear, and just pure human arrogance collided in ways that were just absolutely catastrophic. It's like some kind of group project where the absolute worst people ever got all of the leadership roles. And somehow, the most unsettling part is that a lot of these asylums didn't start out as torture chambers. They started with reformers who genuinely believed that they were going to help build a system that was far more humane than what they had at the time. Before modern psychology and psychiatry even existed, most societies just didn't have any kind of reliable framework to understand mental illness. Things like depression were often thought to be possession, psychosis was demonic influence, epilepsy was spiritual corruption, and if somebody had any form of emotional instability, it could be proof that they had been cursed, it was some sort of divine punishment, or they were just simply morally compromised. So basically, for centuries, mental illness was kind of framed into one of four things: a spiritual failure, a divine punishment, witchcraft, or evidence that that person was cursed. And the medical treatments were just as wild as the diagnosis. Without any real neuroscience, treatments often would blend superstition, religion, and a whole lot of guesswork. The common things that they used were like bloodletting, exorcisms, starvations, beatings, and trepanation, which, if you don't know, actually involves drilling holes into the skull of the afflicted individual in order to release the evil spirits. So, in medieval Europe, along with these absolutely wild forms of treatment, people with mental illness were often also imprisoned, abandoned, or displayed publicly. If I ever decide to do another deep dive on how later eras just basically turned illness into spectacle, there is so much nightmare fuel there, and this is part of it. But for now, the important point is this. When the era of the asylums actually arrived, it emerged as this much more organized response to mental illness. But here's the thing. Organized does not mean compassion. One of the most important figures when it comes to early psychiatric reform was a gentleman named Philippe Pinel. He was a French physician that was working in the late 1700s, both during and after the chaos of the French Revolution. So, compared to the standards of the time, this dude sounded radically compassionate. Before reformers like him entered the conversation, mentally ill patients were often treated more like dangerous animals instead of sick human beings. They would be chained to walls, beaten, locked in filthy cells, or displayed publicly as a form of entertainment. Pinel became famous for ordering that the chains be removed from patients at hospitals in France. And historically, some parts of that story have probably been a little bit dramatized over time, but the symbolism is what actually mattered because what he was pushing was a revolutionary idea that maybe mental illness in people deserve to be treated with dignity. I know, it is an absolutely groundbreaking concept for humanity, apparently. He believed that patients should be observed medically, they should be spoken to calmly, and then they should be treated with structure and compassion, not fear and punishment. Now, this approach became labeled as moral treatment, and for a little while, it genuinely improved the outcomes compared to the horrifying brutality that had come before it. But here's the really tragically ironic part, okay? The very asylum system that Pinel helped to reform eventually became the thing he was trying to stop. Overcrowding, underfunding, and bad science slowly turned most institutions back into places of control instead of places for care. And that's a reoccurring theme you're going to hear again and again and again in today's video. Philippe Pinel was not the only one, though. In 1796, a group of English Quakers founded something called the York Retreat after one of their own people had died under very suspicious circumstances inside of a traditional asylum of that time. And that really tells you how frightening psychiatric institutions were already becoming. The Quakers were horrified by what they saw in the existing mental hospitals. There were chains, beatings, filthy conditions, public humiliation. Patients were not treated like people. They weren't even treated as well as livestock. So they decided they wanted to attempt something that was completely radical at the time, actually treating mentally ill people as if they might be human beings. Now, unlike most institutions of that era, the York Retreat focused on things like kindness, routine, conversation, peaceful surroundings, meaningful work, and very minimal physical punishment. Patients lived in much cleaner environments. They spent a lot of time outdoors. They were encouraged to maintain dignity and to still have social connections. And this too became part of the moral treatment model, the idea that calm surroundings and compassionate care would improve mental health. And it genuinely seemed like it was working. But that's kind of the irony that hangs over this whole story. Many later asylums would copy the appearance of places like the York Retreat. They would build the gardens and the sunlight and the beautiful, peaceful architecture, but they would never invest the time in preserving things like staffing, compassion, or the very philosophy that made the York Retreat work. Over time, a movement that was built around dignity was just hollowed out by fear, bureaucracy, and neglect. Now, what followed these revolutionary ideas was not a very sudden collapse, but it was more like a very slow institutional decay that was driven by overcrowding, underfunding, bad science, and just simply the growing belief that control mattered way more than care. Very quickly, the asylum system discovered that it had a problem. Actually, no, it had several thousand problems. They were overcrowded, understaffed, underfunded, filled with patients suffering from conditions that doctors didn't understand. The original goal had been treatment, but the reality had become containment. And when containment stopped working, psychiatry did what humanity has done throughout history when it was faced with a problem that it didn't understand. It started experimenting, and what followed would become one of the darkest chapters in medical history. Because if the asylum itself was the nightmare, the treatments were where things got truly terrifying. Now, here's the thing. As the system was slowly deteriorating, the so-called treatments got darker and darker. Some of them were cruel, most of them were dangerous, and almost all of them were somehow justified in the name of it being some form of medicine. But really what they did was simply blur the line into coercion. They used things like sedatives, restraints, isolation, and extreme physical interventions, and they were justified But really, all they were tools to suppress distressed people and enforce them to comply. If the patient stopped resisting, the chart would call it progress, and everybody got to feel real sciency for the day. One of their favorite things, and this one blew my mind, was something called rotational therapy. Patients would be strapped into spinning chairs and rotated violently for extended periods of time. Now, doctors claimed that this would stabilize the nervous system, but in practice, it often caused vomiting, disorientation, collapse, and severe distress. All it was some sort of horrific carnival ride on max level. And then there was insulin coma therapy, which just by the name alone, you know this one's going to be wild. So it was introduced in the 1920s, and it involved giving patients massive doses of insulin that would trigger seizures, unconsciousness, and even full-blown comas. Now, it was promoted as a way to reset severe mental illness, but obviously what we know now is that that high dose of insulin had some serious risks involved, from brain damage to death. And then there's the lobotomy. And honestly, this section really does deserve its own video because the lobotomies had an entire heyday and it really needs to be studied if we ever hope to have any chance of not repeating history. And maybe I'll get on that. Let me know if you guys are interested in that. But what's important to know is that lobotomies became the most infamous psychiatric procedure of the 20th century. They were originally created by Antonio Igas, and it was promoted as cutting the connections in the frontal lobe, and they made it sound pretty simple, a lot more simple than it actually was. In the United States, a gentleman named Walter Freeman popularized what was called the transorbital method, and he would use an ice pick-like instrument and insert it through the patient's eye sockets. Now, some patients would emerge quieter, which doctors often called improvement, even though that's not exactly what it was. Most of the patients were left emotionally flattened, cognitively impaired, incontinent, disabled, or, just simply dead because somebody shoved an ice pick in their brain. Now, the procedure spread because of desperation, media hype, and institutional pressure that was overwhelming things like caution, evidence, anything like that. And that really is a terrible combination for everyone involved, except for, like the guy trying to brand himself as the miracle worker lobotomist. Okay, before we go any further, we really have to stop and talk about the time when psychiatry started deciding to play God for a while, and that was the eugenics era. And it really was one of the ugliest chapters in modern medical history. In the late 19th and early 20th century, parts of the medical and scientific world became absolutely obsessed with the idea that society could just somehow improve itself as a whole by controlling who was allowed to reproduce. And I know it sounds monstrous. And you know what? That's because it absolutely was. And once that thinking fused with psychiatry, the damage that followed was enormous. So the term eugenics was actually coined back in 1883 by a gentleman named Francis Galton. He was actually the cousin of Charles Darwin, and Galton believed things like intelligence, criminality, poverty, feeble-mindedness, mental illness, alcoholism, and even morality could be inherited genetically, which, okay, it does sound crazy, I know, but to be fair, genetics can influence some mental health conditions. Like modern science shows that disorders like schizophrenia, bipolar, autism, and depression can involve some hereditary risk factors. But early eugenicists took that idea and then drove it straight off a moral cliff. Now, at the time, scientists barely understood genetics at all, and DNA had not even been identified yet. So, eugenicists made this enormous assumption that was based on weak to no data, biased observations, and social prejudices that they disguised as science. They claimed that poverty was also inherited, criminal behavior was genetic, intellectual disability could infect all of society, and that entire families were just biologically inferior and should be ended. Modern genetics rejects that simplistic thinking completely. Human behavior and mental illness are shaped by a number of things: genetics, trauma, environment, nutrition, education, stress, social conditions, and neurological development. There is not a single criminal gene. There is no bad blood and no DNA strand that's labeled as likes jazz and moral degeneracy. Human biology is vastly more complicated than eugenics ever believed, but unfortunately, bad science becomes very dangerous once governments get excited about it. And boy, did governments get excited about eugenics. Psychiatric hospitals and institutions became very deeply tied to the eugenics movement throughout the early 1900s because many doctors and politicians began viewing institutionalized people as just being genetically unfit, which is a horrifying sentence, really. Patients with mental illness, epilepsy, developmental disabilities, addiction, physical disabilities, or even behavioral problems were increasingly labeled as threats to the entire health of society. And once people are getting described as biological threats instead of being recognized as human beings, well, let's just say it gets horrifying quickly. Well, this is where the story is going to get truly ugly because beginning in the early 1900s, multiple countries passed forced sterilization laws, and those laws targeted institutionalized people. The United States alone forcibly sterilized tens of thousands of people. Many victims were psychiatric patients, disabled people, poor women, minorities, prisoners, or people simply considered socially undesirable. The criteria were horrifyingly vague. Women could be sterilized for promiscuity, low IQ scores, behavioral issues, poverty, or just being called an unfit mother. Now imagine going to a state institution for help and leaving unable to ever have children because somebody with a clipboard decided that your genetics were just inconvenient. One of the darkest moments of this whole thing came in 1927 when the U.S. Supreme Court heard the case Buck versus Bell. A young woman, Carrie Buck, was forcibly sterilized after being labeled as feeble-minded. Now, historians who have reviewed this case now believe that Carrie was likely not even intellectually disabled and was probably more likely the victim of abuse and systemic prejudice. But the Supreme Court upheld the sterilization law with the simple reason, and I'm quoting here. This is an actual quote. 3 generations of imbeciles are enough. That is one of the coldest and most horrifying sentences ever written in the American legal history. But that ruling legitimized forced sterilization programs across the country for decades. Okay, I know at this point you are probably thinking that eugenics can't get any worse, but let me tell you, it absolutely can. We're going to hit the part where history just gets chilling because Nazi Germany heavily studied and admired the American eugenics program. Let me say that again. Nazi Germany was studying and admiring eugenics. Now, American sterilization laws and psychiatric theories directly influenced parts of the Nazis' racial policy. These took that eugenics program and massively expanded it into this gigantic sterilization program and eventually used it as a reason to murder a number of disabled and mentally ill people. It was through a program that they called Action T4, and it was where psychiatric patients and disabled individuals were systematically killed because they were considered life unworthy of life. Some of the methods and the bureaucratic systems later used in concentration camps were also first tested on disabled patients. And that is kind of the moment that this stops being bad medical history and becomes a warning about what happens when pseudoscience fuses with state power. Now, eventually, World War II came and ended, and eugenics became internationally discredited, mostly because the world looked at Nazi atrocities and collectively realized that, ooh, that ideology was catastrophically evil. Modern genetics, neuroscience, and psychology eventually dismantled most eugenics claims with straight up science. And today we understand that mental illness is very complex, intelligence is multifactorial, trauma profoundly shapes human behavior, and humans' worth cannot be measured just biologically, which seems so obvious now, but I gotta tell you, history just keeps proving that human beings become very dangerous the moment we convince ourselves that some lives matter less than others, all in the name of the greater good. Here's why this section matters so much, because eugenics revealed one of the darkest truths in asylum history. The danger was never just bad hospitals, it was the belief that certain people were fundamentally less human than everyone else. Once medicine stopped asking, how do we help suffering people, and started asking, how do we eliminate undesirable people, the entire system became morally radioactive. And honestly, this is a lesson still echoing today, because every generation really likes to believe that it would never fall for dangerous pseudoscience or dehumanization. But here's the thing, history suggests that we should probably stay pretty darn humble about that. So now we've covered how asylums began, why they spread, and some of the horrors that these places tried to pass off as treatment. And that's not where the story ends, because all of these things had to happen somewhere, right? They had to happen inside of massive stone institutions built on the promise of healing and the confidence of people who were absolutely certain they knew what they were doing. But history would prove that they often did not, because scattered across both America and Europe were hospitals that started as symbols of hope and compassion and ended as cautionary tales. Some became overcrowded, some became abusive, some became notorious, and a few became so infamous that their names still carry a chill more than a century later. So, before we talk about the full on collapse of the asylum system, we need to visit the places that made it infamous. Welcome to the institutions that became the face of psychiatric horror. So, Bethlem wasn't just one of the earliest psychiatric hospitals in history, it actually became one of the clearest blueprints for institutional horror. And its nickname was Bedlam, which eventually entered the English language as slang for the word chaos. Now, that alone pretty much tells you everything you need to know about Bethlem's reputation. It was founded all the way back in 1247 as a religious institution that was linked to Saint Mary of Bethlehem. Bethlem gradually evolved into one of Europe's earliest dedicated sites for confining mentally ill patients. For centuries, it sat at the center of English psychiatric history, which would sound super impressive if that history were not also a running catalog of how badly society could misunderstand mental illness. By the 16 and 1700s, patients were chained to walls, kept in filthy cells, and subjected to harsh physical regimens built around things like bleeding, purging, blistering, vomiting, and ice baths. At different points, members of the public were also invited to pay and walk through the wards in order to stare at patients as if the institution were some sort of grotesque tourist attraction. Accounts describe the visitors would be mocking patients, laughing at them, and sometimes provoking reactions from them on purpose. I have to say, it is hard to imagine a clearer example of how completely institutionalized people were stripped of dignity. Suffering had become a spectacle, and the public called it entertainment. So, yeah, one of Britain's most famous psychiatric hospitals briefly doubled as a deeply disturbing day out in London. Investigators who later entered the doors of Bethlem during the reform inquiries described freezing rooms, filthy cells, patients chained to walls, people left naked in the winter, blocked sewage systems, and inmates living in just human waste. Patients were sleeping on straw bedding that was soaked in pure urine and filth. Others were chained beside violent or severely distressed patients for long periods of time. One report described patients' limbs being damaged by cold and restraints. And because mental illness already carried this enormous stigma, the survivors had little to no credibility outside of the institution, which meant anyone who tried to report what was happening was never believed. One of Bethlem's most fascinating patients was a gentleman named James Tilly Matthews, whom historians now believe probably was one of the earliest fully documented cases of schizophrenia. Now, Matthews believed that there was this secret group called the Heirloom Gang, and that they were using some sort of invisible machine to manipulate thoughts and torture people remotely, which is a delusion that sounds strangely modern, almost like a centuries old version of mind control conspiracy theories. But beneath the bizarre details is something tragic. Matthews spent years and years institutionalized during an era when psychiatry barely understood psychosis at all. There were no antipsychotics, no modern therapy, no neuroscience, just confinement and observation inside one of history's most infamous institutions. And then we have James Norris, who was probably the most infamous survivor from Bethlem and one of the saddest stories. James Norris was an American Marine, and he was held at the hospital from the early 1800s. And what investigators found when they finally saw him shocked even the people who were used to the asylum abuse. Norris had repeatedly spent around a decade restrained in an iron harness bolted to the wall. Iron bands were wrapped around his neck, chest, arms, and waist, and they severely restricted his movement. He couldn't walk around or stretch or even lay down. His muscles had reportedly deteriorated from the years of confinement. And here's the truly terrifying part of Mr. Norris's tale. Bethlem staff went on to defend him being chained to the wall like that for a decade as a humane form of treatment. Yeah, because nothing says medical care quite like turning a man into a part of the furniture. When reformer Edward Wakefield exposed Norris's condition during the 1814 inspection, public outrage exploded, and there were investigators just combing through the facility after that. Norris had become one of the major symbols of asylum reform in Britain because once the public saw what had been happening inside of its walls, the institution could no longer hide behind words like treatment. What makes Bethlem so historically important is the fact that it reveals the pattern that the entire asylum system would always follow, a place created under one moral framework that slowly turned into an institution of spectacle, punishment, and neglect once society decided that the people inside mattered far less than the people managing them. It still exists today. It's in a radically transformed state, but its early legacy is basically impossible to separate from the history of psychiatric abuse. The fact that its name became shorthand for chaos is not just linguistic trivia, it's basically a historical warning label. Danvers opened its doors in 1878 with enormous optimism. It was built around something called the Kirkbride method, and that was a belief that sunlight, fresh air, routine, and beautiful surroundings would help heal the mind. And for a brief moment, that vision didn't seem misguided, but by the mid 20th century, Danvers had become catastrophically overcrowded. The hospital was originally designed to hold around 500 patients, but at its peak, it held well over 2,000 people. And once again, the asylum system followed its favorite pattern, good intentions collapsing into organized human misery. Former workers and patients described wards that were packed so tightly that people were forced to sleep in hallways, on floors, and even in basements. Imagine struggling with severe mental illness while living inside what had essentially become a stressed out human warehouse with Gothic architecture. Danvers became infamous for its underground tunnel system, which connected all of the buildings across its massive campus. And that was something that actually became pretty common in a lot of asylums built in America. Former employees described patients being moved through the tunnels during winter, and over time, the passageways attracted a lot of rumors about disappearances, secret transfers, and abandoned sections that were just left untouched for decades. Now, to be fair, some of the wilder stories likely grew more into urban legends over time, but when a hospital already has overcrowding, lobotomies, isolation wards, and underground tunnels, it's basically already handed horror writers material for free. Reports from both former patients and workers described things like heavy sedation, straitjackets, isolation rooms, electroshock therapy, and of course, everyone's favorite, lobotomies. And like many institutions of the era, Danvers increasingly began prioritizing control of the patients over recovery because overcrowding spiraled so quickly. Patients who became quieter after treatment were labeled as improved, even though the improvement was really just emotional flattening, trauma, or exhaustion. Some former employees also later described the emotional toll of just working there. Staff shortages were severe, violence was constant, entire wards became difficult to manage safely, and one horrifying pattern that appears all throughout asylum history. The worse conditions became, the more not just the patients, but also the staff psychologically deteriorated. Modern psychology recognizes that chronic overcrowding and institutional stress can increase things like aggression, burnout, depression, emotional detachment, and trauma responses. And that means that these hospitals weren't just damaging the patients, they were damaging the people working inside of them too. Part of what made Danvers so infamous is that the building itself just looks absolutely terrifying. You've got these huge Gothic towers that are isolated up on a hilltop. Inside the building, you find things like long, shadowy corridors, underground tunnels, and decaying wards. It looks exactly like what people imagine when they hear the word asylum. And that's part of why it later inspired a lot of horror fiction, including Session 9 and settings that were associated with Batman's Arkham style asylum mythology. But the real horror of Danvers was never ghosts. It was the reality that thousands of vulnerable people were sent there hoping for treatment, and many instead disappeared into an overcrowded system that slowly stopped seeing them as human beings. Construction of Trans-Allegheny began in 1858 and stretched into the Civil War era, with the hospital eventually opening to patients in 1864. Like Danvers, it was built on the Kirkbride idea that sunlight, fresh air, and grand architecture would help heal the mind. But what followed was a much darker version of that dream. The hospital was built to house around 250 patients, and at its peak in the 1950s, it held well over 2,400 people. At that scale, the asylum was no longer functioning like a hospital. It was functioning more like a small city of trauma and neglect. One of the most disturbing things about Trans-Allegheny is why people were admitted there in the first place. Historical records list patients that were institutionalized from things ranging from grief to domestic troubles, asthma, alcoholism, egotism, laziness, greed, epilepsy, and just behavior that society simply found inconvenient. Imagine being sent to this intimidating Gothic asylum because somebody decided you just had too much attitude. That is not psychiatry, that is weaponized annoyance. And due to the fact that the diagnoses were incredibly primitive back then, people with completely different conditions would often be thrown and packed together in rooms. You would find people that had schizophrenia, PTSD, dementia, addiction, developmental disabilities, and neurological disorders crammed together. Treatment became chaos almost immediately. Former reports describe wards that were so overcrowded that patients were sleeping in hallways, on floors, and packed tightly into rooms that were never meant to house even half that many people. Sanitation was non existent. A 1949 investigation by the Charleston Gazette found poor heating, poor lighting, insufficient furniture, and unsanitary conditions across most of the hospital. And modern psychology now understands something that asylum doctors back then barely even recognized. Overcrowding itself worsens mental illness. Studies show that chronic overcrowding increases aggression, stress, sleep disruption, emotional dysregulation, and psychosis symptoms. That means the institution itself was actively making the patients worse. And then came the procedures. Patients at Trans-Allegheny were treated to a number of different methods of torture, from insulin shock therapy to hydrotherapy, electroshock therapy, heavy sedations, and of course, lobotomies. And that is just an absolutely brutal sentence when you list it together like that. One of the darkest chapters involved the hospital actually becoming part of the West Virginia Lobotomy Project during the 1950s. Yeah, that was a real thing. Psychiatrist Walter Freeman worked in West Virginia institutions in an attempt to reduce the severe overcrowding through the use of lobotomies, because apparently the official solution to too many patients became, what if fewer of them had functioning frontal lobes? A haunting part of Trans-Allegheny's history is how many people died there. See, researchers don't even know the exact number, but historians connected to the asylum have estimated that the deaths reached well into the five figures over its long history. The asylum even maintained its own cemetery on grounds, which is very unsettling because it reinforces something really scary. A lot of patients checked in and never left. They simply vanished into the institution until they died there. Former employees and a lot of records also reveal another disturbing pattern that we've seen throughout asylum history. Trans-Allegheny also psychologically damaged the staff as well. Understaffing became severe, violence broke out, burnout skyrocketed. Now, modern trauma science shows that chronic exposure to institutional stress will increase things like emotional detachment, depression, aggression, and compassion fatigue, meaning that some of these workers slowly became numb simply as a means to survive the environment around them. And once emotional numbness enters a system responsible for vulnerable people, let's just say it gets dark. Today, the asylum is famous for paranormal tours and ghost stories, and honestly, the building practically manufactures nightmare fuel. It has endless corridors, towering Gothic architecture, underground tunnels, abandoned wards, peeling paint, and decades of human suffering layered into the walls. But the real reason people remain obsessed with Trans-Allegheny isn't because they think ghosts are hiding in the hallways. It's because the building represents something unsettling, a place that started with compassion and slowly transformed into a machine for containing human suffering once society stopped seeing the patients as people. Bethlem was the face of old asylum horror. Well, Willowbrook became the moment Americans realized that institutional abuse was not ancient history. This was not medieval Europe or Victorian psychiatry. It was modern America. We had television, suburbs, highways, moon landings. But meanwhile, inside of a state institution in New York, thousands of disabled children were living in conditions so horrific that viewers struggled to even believe the footage they saw was real. Willowbrook originally opened in the 1940s as a facility for children with intellectual and developmental disabilities. The official vision sounded very compassionate. Education, care, treatment, support. It's the usual we're helping brochure language that institutions love right before history gets dark. By the 1960s, the facility was massively overcrowded. More than 6,000 residents were packed into buildings that were designed for far, far fewer people. And once again, the asylum system started following its favorite storyline. Once the population swelled far beyond what the buildings and the staff could handle, the institution stopped functioning like a place of care and started operating like a system of mass neglect. Both former residents and investigators describe children wandering naked through wards, patients sitting in human waste, overcrowded dormitories, violent outbursts, severe understaffing, and residents receiving little to no meaningful stimulation or education. Some children reportedly would spend hours rocking back and forth or simply staring blankly into space. Modern neuroscience can tell us why, though. Extreme neglect and understimulation, especially during childhood, severely impacts things like emotional development, cognition, communication, stress regulation, and social behavior. Society built a facility for these vulnerable children and then created conditions that deepened their trauma, it delayed their development, and it stripped away all of their dignity. One of the most haunting details about this place came from both survivors, journalists, investigators, and staff. They all said the same thing: the smell hit you first. The former visitors and investigators and everyone that spent any time there described this overwhelming odor of human waste, sweat, body odor, disinfectant, decay. Reporter Geraldo Rivera described entering the wards and witnessing scenes so absolutely shocking, he compared them to snake pits. Patients were screaming from overcrowded rooms, and others sat silently in corners. Some were fighting each other physically, and many were receiving little to no personal attention because the staff was responsible for an impossible number of residents. Imagine trying to care compassionately for dozens upon dozens of severely traumatized children all at once. This system was literally collapsing under its own weight. Now, if you think this can't get any worse, I'm going to hit you with the part of the story where it's going to be like, yeah, this actually happened. During the 1950s and 60s, researchers conducted hepatitis studies at Willowbrook. Some of the newly admitted children were intentionally exposed to the virus in order to study disease progression and potential treatments. The justification was quite simple. They said that the hepatitis infections were already spreading quite rapidly through the institution due to the poor sanitary conditions and the overcrowded nature of the hospital, which really is one of the bleakest medical loopholes I have ever heard. Technically, these children were already at risk because the institution was catastrophically unsafe. So, hey, what's the harm? That really should make you uncomfortable. Parents were pressured into consenting for this, particularly because institutional placement options for disabled children were incredibly limited. And that just makes this horrifying. These families were not cartoon villains. They were desperate, overwhelmed, out of options, and trapped inside of this broken system. Now, everything for Willowbrook changed in 1972 when Geraldo Rivera aired his investigative report on Willowbrook, and the footage, it just looked apocalyptic. Viewers saw naked children crowded together, patients covered in urine and feces, residents screaming constantly, unattended, and living conditions that resembled disaster zones, not healthcare facilities. Americans were rightly horrified because this is no longer hidden in the 1800s. It is happening right now in one of the most powerful countries on earth. And the public reaction was explosive because suddenly the carefully polished language of special care institutions collided headfirst with visual proof of systemic neglect. And once people saw it, well, they couldn't unsee it. Former Willowbrook residents later described lifelong trauma that was connected to their time at the institution. They recalled fear, violence, neglect, humiliation, and emotional abandonment. Some survivors spoke about how institutional life basically stripped the residents of individuality entirely. They became nothing but numbers, beds, cases, just problems to be managed, but they were never children. Willowbrook became one of the biggest catalysts for disability rights reforms and deinstitutionalization in the United States. The footage that everyone saw exposed something that society had spent decades avoiding. Hidden inside of these secretive, closed off places, they got dangerous because nobody was watching them. And really, that kind of feels painfully modern because the giant institutions mostly disappeared, but the questions never did. What happens to vulnerable people once society decides that they're too difficult, expensive, or inconvenient to be fully cared for? If Willowbrook shocked America, then Pennhurst made it quite clear that that nightmare was not isolated, it was structural. Pennhurst opened its doors in 1908 as a state institution for people with intellectual and developmental disabilities, and like so many places in this story, it began under the language of treatment, education, protection, and rehabilitation. But over time, it became one of the most infamous examples of institutional neglect in America's history. And survivor accounts from this place are absolutely devastating. Pennhurst was designed for a very small population, far less than it eventually held. By the mid 20th century, thousands of residents were packed inside of overcrowded wards. I feel like I'm repeating myself, and it is because I am. They all fell into the same pattern over and over and over again. Once that population swells beyond what the facility could safely support, the same institutional pressures returned. Staff shortages, burnout, restraint, neglect, abuse, and emotional detachment. They became normal. History just keeps repeating this disaster over and over and over again. Residents were crammed into massive dormitory style wards with little to no privacy or personal autonomy. They would spend years or even entire lifetimes inside of that institution. Some were children when they were admitted, and they never got to re enter society. Imagine spending your whole life growing up inside of a crumbling institution while the outside world forgets you exist. Former residents and investigators described filthy living conditions, overcrowded rooms, physical abuse, restraint practices, severe understaffing, and residents left unattended for dangerously long periods of time. A number of the children were reportedly tied to beds or to their cribs. Others suffered unexplained injuries. Residents with communication disabilities were especially vulnerable because many literally could not report anything that happened to them. Former workers later admitted that violence sometimes became normalized just simply because of the exhausted staff trying to manage these impossible numbers of residents. That's not an excuse at all. It is not. What they did was not okay, but it does explain how environments like this slowly rot morally from the inside out. In 1968, reporter Bill Baldini released a documentary titled Suffer the Little Children, exposing Pennhurst to the public. And honestly, that title alone is something else. The footage he captured showed children rocking in corners, overcrowded wards, screaming residents, poor sanitation, and severely neglected patients. Viewers were absolutely horrified because many residents appeared emotionally vacant from years of institutional trauma and sensory deprivation. And once again, America was forced to confront a brutal reality. This was not an isolated bad apple event. The entire institutional model was collapsing on itself. Pennhurst eventually became the center of a landmark legal battle over disability rights and institutionalization. Former residents and advocates argued that patients were being denied education, humane treatment, proper care, and constitutional rights. The resulting court case helped to push deinstitutionalization forward across all of America because once the public saw the conditions and the survivors finally had a voice, Pennhurst became impossible to defend morally. Now, today, Pennhurst is still around and it's famous for ghost tours and paranormal stories. And honestly, those abandoned tunnels, the dark corridors, and the decaying wards scream haunted. But the real horror was never supernatural, it's the history of the place. If there was just one institution that fully embodied the collapse of the American psychiatric system, it would probably be Byberry. Not because it started out uniquely evil, but because it became the perfect storm of overcrowding, underfunding, exhausted staff, failed psychiatry, and a society increasingly willing to hide mentally ill people out of sight. And once that happened, the place deteriorated into something survivors and investigators described as terrifying. Byberry opened in the early 1900s as the Philadelphia State Hospital and was originally meant to help relieve the overcrowding in other psychiatric facilities, which I gotta say is deeply ironic considering it eventually became one of the most overcrowded institutions in America. At its peak, Byberry held thousands upon thousands of patients, and once again, humanity ran the exact same experiment. Maybe stuffing enormous numbers of traumatized people into one giant institution will somehow improve mental health. It did not. Former patients and investigators described filthy wards, violence, overcrowded dormitories, physical abuse, restraint practices, and patients wandering halls in heavily sedated states. Some patients reportedly slept packed together in rooms with no privacy and no sanitation. Others described constant screaming echoing through the wards at night. One of the darkest parts of Byberry's history involved what became known as the wet wards, and these sections housed patients considered severely disturbed or difficult to manage. The conditions there were just horrific. Investigators described floors that were completely drenched in urine, patients constantly being left in filthy clothing, severe neglect, overcrowding, and residents sitting for hours or days with no attention. Once a hospital becomes overwhelmed, care often just gets replaced by containment. Byberry also became infamous for the reports of staff violence and patient abuse. Former residents and whistleblowers described regular beatings, rough restraint practices, intimidation, neglect, and residents left injured or unattended. Some of the staff violence and abuse described there reflected the same corrosive pattern that we've seen in other institutions. Once an environment becomes brutal enough, some people adapt to it in just the worst ways possible. One of the most important chapters for Byberry, though, came during World War II. Conscientious objectors, which were men who refused military service for either moral or religious reasons, were assigned to work inside of psychiatric hospitals instead of fighting overseas. And many of them arrived at Byberry and they were horrified. Those workers described starvation, overcrowding, abuse, untreated injuries, patients restrained for incredibly long periods of time, and conditions that they compared to concentration camps. Imagine anyone who survived World War II and ended up in these facilities, and all they could think was it just reminds them of all these wartime atrocities. But that's how bad the conditions had become. Several conscientious objectors later became outspoken reform advocates because they could not ignore the horrors that they witnessed there. Byberry's reputation finally collapsed after journalists and photographers exposed the conditions to the public. Photographer Charles Lord captured devastating images inside of the institution showing the overcrowded wards, the exhausted patients, skeletal starved residents, people restrained to beds, and emotionally vacant individuals just staring blankly into a camera. Some images looked disturbingly similar to wartime prison camp photography that was circulating at the time, and once Americans saw those photographs, the illusion shattered because suddenly the phrase mental hospital stopped sounding like medicine and it just started sounding like abandonment with paperwork. Today, Byberry remains famous in urban legend circles because of its abandoned tunnels, the vandalized wards, the ghost stories, and the horrifying rumors that are surrounding the building. But its real horror doesn't even need ghosts because the horror is how easy it became for society to hide thousands of individual, vulnerable people inside of an overcrowded institution and slowly just stop seeing them as people at all. Here's the thing. I know we've covered a lot of American institutions, but we didn't corner the market on asylum atrocities. Let's check out Lake Alice Psychiatric Hospital, which opened in 1950 in rural New Zealand as a large state run institution. Now, on paper, it had all of the familiar ingredients of reform era optimism: open space, work programs, distance from crowded cities, and the promise of structured care. The campus included farms, workshops, laundry facilities, staff housing, and even its own fire station. And on paper, it sounded like the future of psychiatric care, a peaceful rural environment where patients could supposedly heal away from crowded cities. The usual, this definitely won't become horrifying later. Yeah. By the 1970s, the hospital had also built a child and adolescent unit that was run by a psychiatrist named Selwyn Leeks. And this is where things took a turn. Decades later, investigations and the Royal Commission found that many children at Lake Alice suffered through abuse, cruelty, and treatment that met the legal definition of torture. And that matters because this was not some distant relic of 19th century psychiatry. It was a modern institution harming modern children under the language of care. One of the most horrific details about Lake Alice is who actually ended up there. According to survivor accounts and inquiry findings, many children admitted to the unit were not severely mentally ill at all. Some of them were traumatized, neurodivergents, in state care, from difficult homes, or simply just considered troubled by adults who didn't know what to do with them. Imagine being a traumatized teenager with behavioral issues and getting dropped off into a locked psychiatric institution in the middle of nowhere. That is not treatment, that's the opening of a psychological horror film. Former patients consistently described arriving at Lake Alice immediately just feeling terrified. They recalled locked wards, fenced ground, intimidating buildings, isolation, and an atmosphere of constant fear. One survivor said it felt like they were going into maximum security prison. One of the most haunting survivor stories came from a young boy who was sent there. He was roughly 13 years old, and he secretly wrote a hidden message in a foreign language so that the staff would be unable to understand it, and he sent it to his mother. And all the note said was, "I have been given electric shock. The pain is very bad." That sentence is devastating. Underneath all of the medical language and the government reports, this was just a terrified child trying to tell someone he had been hurt. Survivors allege that the children at Lake Alice were subjected to electroconvulsive shocks, not for legitimate psychiatric treatment, but as a punishment and a form of behavior control. They reportedly described shocks being administered for things like swearing, bedwetting, acting out, disobedience, or just simply upsetting the staff. Some survivors also alleged that the shocks were applied to very sensitive parts of the body with no anesthesia, which is far less mental health care and much more medieval torture with paperwork. Survivors also described painful injections, heavy sedation, solitary confinement, physical assaults, humiliation, and just living in constant fear of punishment. And that really is a detail that appears over and over in all of the survivors' testimony: fear. These children described hearing keys approaching down the hallway and panicking because they thought another punishment session was coming. Others described trying to avoid the staff entirely, and some others recalled just having to listen to children scream in pain and fear during treatments. Many survivors said that they spent decades trying to convince people that the abuse that happened there was real because, once again, asylum history repeats its favorite nightmare. The people inside of the institutions are often the last people that society believes. Over time, investigations, survivor testimony, and the Royal Commission inquiry concluded serious abuse had most definitely occurred at Lake Alice. The New Zealand government later acknowledged that some survivors experienced torture inside the children and adolescent unit. Think about how insane that sentence is. A modern democratic government officially acknowledging torture happened inside of a psychiatric hospital for children. Not in the 1800s, not during medieval history. In modern times, this hospital closed in 1999. But for survivors, the damage didn't end when the buildings were shut down, because the real horrors of Lake Alice were not just the institution itself, but just how easily vulnerable children disappeared into a system that claimed to be helping them while quietly teaching them terror instead. The facility began in the 1970s under Matthew Israel, and it was focused on people with severe developmental disabilities and behavioral disorders. It was said to specialize in extreme cases that involved self injury, aggression, and complex support needs, which really is exactly the kind of context that often leads families and systems to tolerate measures that they would reject anywhere else. The Judge Rottenberg Center became internationally controversial for using something called Graduated Electronic Decelerator, or GED, which delivered electrical shocks to residents as a form of punishment for certain behaviors. And this is where the story gets really polarizing. See, supporters argued that the treatments prevented the residents from severely injuring themselves, attacking others, or requiring heavy sedation. But critics argued that the practice was psychologically and physically abusive. In fact, human rights organizations, disability advocates, and the UN experts condemned the use of this device for years, describing aspects of this treatment as potentially just amounting to torture. That's kind of not the type of review a medical institution wants to hang framed on your wall. Both former residents and advocates described an atmosphere that was dominated by both fear and anticipation of punishment. Survivor accounts and investigations described repeated electric shocks, restraint practices, emotional distress, food restrictions, and constant anxiety about making mistakes. Some former residents reportedly described becoming hypervigilant, which meant they constantly monitored their behavior in order to avoid punishment. Modern trauma psychology actually explains why this happens. When people exist under unpredictable punishment systems, the brain can become locked into chronic stress responses, and they involve things like hypervigilance, anxiety, disassociation, and long term trauma symptoms, meaning that this institution was not just modifying behavior, it was conditioning fear. One of the most infamous incidents came in 2007, and that was when the staff reportedly administered shocks after a prank caller posing as a supervisor gave them the order. The story absolutely horrified people because it suggested that the punishment system had become so normalized that extreme instructions from some random voice on the phone were treated as plausible. And then here's where things get complicated, because some parents defended the center strongly. Families of residents that had severe injurious behavior argued that the treatments prevented further injuries for the patients, but critics, meanwhile, argued that the center relied on punishment-based conditioning, and that violated human dignity, and it also caused long-term trauma. And honestly, that ethical tension is exactly why the Judge Rottenberg Center became such a lightning rod. It forces society to confront a terrifying question that psychiatry has never been able to fully solve. How far can treatment go before it stops being treatment? Winterbourne View was a private hospital in South Gloucestershire, England, operated by Castlebeck Care. The facility specialized in treating adults that had learning disabilities, autism, and behavioral or mental health challenges. Now, on paper, the hospital was supposed to provide assessment, treatment, and support for vulnerable patients who needed specialized care. Instead, investigators later uncovered a culture many described as cruel, humiliating, and psychologically abusive. Winterbourne View scandal exploded after a BBC Panorama aired a documentary titled Undercover Care: The Abuse Exposed. Reporter Paul Kenyon had sent an undercover journalist into the hospital posing as a care worker, and what the hidden cameras captured absolutely horrified the UK. The footage showed staff slapping patients, pinning residents to the floor, taunting vulnerable people, dragging patients, pulling hair, and verbally humiliating residents. Former patients and their families later described an atmosphere of constant intimidation and terror. Patients were reportedly mocked during emotional breakdowns, restrained aggressively, denied dignity, and psychologically tortured by the staff. One patient was shown being repeatedly restrained while clearly distressed, while another had cold water poured on them and then was reportedly locked outside in freezing temperatures. Imagine being autistic, overwhelmed, frightened, unable to fully advocate for yourself, and the people responsible for protecting you start treating your distress as if it were a joke. One of the most disturbing elements wasn't even the physical violence, though it was the psychological humiliation. The hidden footage showed the staff provoking patients intentionally, swearing at residents, mocking fears, threatening vulnerable individuals, and escalating emotional distress purely for their own amusement. A clinical psychologist that reviewed the footage described aspects of the treatment as pure psychological torture. And that phrase kind of hangs over this whole story because modern trauma science already tells us something incredibly important. People with autism, developmental disabilities, or trauma histories are often especially vulnerable to emotional dysregulation under chronic fear and humiliation. So, this institution was not calming patients, it was destabilizing them. But let me make this a little bit worse for you because a senior nurse named Terry Bryan had repeatedly raised concerns before the scandal exploded publicly, but all of their warnings did not ever trigger any kind of meaningful investigation. And that failure is one of the bleakest constants in institutional history. The signals are often there long before the public sees the footage, they just get ignored. Now, when Panorama aired the footage in 2011, public outrage exploded across Britain because viewers weren't watching a few bad employees, they were watching a system fail vulnerable people in real time. 11 staff members were eventually convicted of abuse or neglect related offenses, and several received prison sentences. The hospital itself shut down shortly thereafter, but the scandal triggered massive national conversations about things like institutional care, autism treatment, restraint practices, and the continued existence of large inpatient facilities for disabled people. Because Winterbourne forced society to confront something that was really uncomfortable. You can modernize the building, you can modernize the uniforms, you can modernize the branding, and still recreate the exact same institutional horrors if the culture becomes toxic enough. Now, here's where it feels like a punch to the soul because after Winterbourne, the governments did promise a lot of reform. Investigations happened, committees formed, policies changed, and then similar scandals kept happening anyway. Facilities like Worlton Hall were later exposed for remarkably similar abuse. There was taunting, intimidation, unnecessary restraints, humiliation, and emotional cruelty towards both autistic and disabled residents, which reveals one of the darkest truths for the whole story. The real danger was never just the old asylums. It's what happens anytime vulnerable people are hidden inside of closed systems where oversight fails, staff is burned out, accountability disappears, and society just stops paying attention. And honestly, if you really want a truly modern continuation of asylum style abuse, the troubled teen industry deserves its own video entirely. And maybe I'll film one, I don't know. Programs in residential treatment centers across multiple countries have faced allegations that involve things like isolation, restraint deaths, emotional abuse, forced labor, humiliation tactics, over medication, and severe psychological trauma. Survivors from some facilities described experiences that were eerily similar to institutional abuse from decades earlier. And that's so scary because these places market themselves as therapy, behavioral reform, or simply treatment. But again, it's the same pattern, just different branding. Humanity really loves re releasing the same horror franchise just with updated packaging. But here's the thing, asylums did not collapse because of just one villain or one bad treatment. They failed because of ignorance, overcrowding, underfunding, pseudoscience, and fear, all reinforcing one another until patients were not treated like people anymore. They just became problems to be managed. For most of asylum's history, doctors were trying to treat conditions that they just didn't understand. Without neuroscience, brain imaging, or effective medications, psychiatry had to rely on things like guesswork, superstition, and whatever just seemed to make patients quieter, which is not a sentence you really want anywhere near your treatment plan. That meant that treatment often became a search for whatever made the patients just look calmer, quieter, or easier to manage. Relief and obedience were constantly confused with recovery. So, after learning about all those horrors that happen inside of some of the biggest asylums, it's not surprising to learn that by the 50s and 60s, the asylum system was actively collapsing under the weight of overcrowding, abuse scandals, failed treatment, and just simply public outrage. Investigative reports on places like Willowbrook and Pennhurst made it impossible to pretend that the old model was even humane. So the United States launched one of the largest mental health care policy shifts in modern history. It was called the institutionalization. The idea, at least in theory, was not to abandon people. It was to replace giant psychiatric institutions with community based care. That meant things like outpatient treatment, supportive housing, crisis services, medication access, and society integration. In other words, they would move people out of locked warehouses and into systems that might actually support life in the real world. Several things pushed this movement forward. First, we had psychiatric medications. They were invented and improved upon, and for the first time in modern history, they gave some patients the ability to function outside of institutions. And then there was the civil rights movement, which changed the public's attitude. People were increasingly questioning whether government should have unlimited power to institutionalize people. Then, of course, there was all of the public outrage over the different scandals that were exposed through video and articles and photography. Once people saw it, they could no longer ignore it. And that really pushed deinstitutionalization forward. America felt like they had no choice but to get rid of these huge asylums. So, what happened? Well, it didn't go so well because society did the most human thing imaginable and they funded all of the closures, but not the replacement systems. The federal government promised thousands of community mental health centers during the 1960s, and less than half of that were ever built. And many of the ones that were created were underfunded, understaffed, overwhelmed, and they only focused on short term crisis stabilization, which is kind of like shutting down the fire department because you're planning to buy better hoses someday in the future. But meanwhile, psychiatric hospitals emptied incredibly rapidly, and suddenly thousands upon thousands of severely mentally ill people were released into communities with nowhere near enough housing, treatment, long term care, addiction support, or case management. Now, some patients absolutely thrived outside of these institutions, but many others just fell right through the cracks. Modern psychiatrists call one of the phenomena that occurred the revolving door problem. Basically, it's where patients cycle through hospitals, shelters, emergency rooms, temporary psych holds, detox centers, and jails over and over and over again. It's just simply a pattern of stabilize, release, crisis, repeat. It's really just the bleakest loyalty rewards program ever. Now, modern research constantly links deinstitutionalization failures to the revolving door phenomena and the increased amount of homelessness and incarcerated people with severe mental illness. Basically, prisons became the new asylum. And here's the truly disturbing part: America never really stopped institutionalizing mentally ill people, we just moved them to a different building. Today, jails and prisons have effectively become some of the largest mental health facilities in the country, and that should make you uncomfortable. Studies estimate that enormous percentages of incarcerated populations struggle with things like schizophrenia, bipolar, PTSD, addiction, and severe untreated trauma, which means that society essentially replaced Victorian asylum with terrible ethics with just mass incarceration with fluorescent lighting. And that's not exactly the triumphant mental health ending that humanity was hoping for. One of the biggest modern consequences of the failed deinstitutionalization movement is visible in basically every major city. Large numbers of chronically unhoused individuals struggle with severe mental illness and addiction disorders. And here's the uncomfortable truth: many of these people would never have survived independently without consistent long term support. But modern systems often provide fragmented care instead, which means short hospital stays, inconsistent medication access, limited housing, and overwhelmed crisis services. So people bounce endlessly between systems never designed for long term recovery. And honestly, that could be the most tragic thing of the whole story. Deinstitutionalization began as a human rights movement, but without funding and infrastructure, freedom sometimes becomes just abandonment. And now, with the fallout becoming so incredibly visible, governments are starting to revisit the idea of involuntary treatment and psychiatric hospitalization. Modern fights over homelessness, addiction, forced treatment, public safety, and psychiatric commitment laws are directly connected to deinstitutionalization's failures. Some policymakers argue that society needs more psychiatric beds, stronger intervention laws, and expanded involuntary treatment. But critics warn that this could reopen the door to institutional abuse and mass confinement all over again. And honestly, that tension sits at the center of modern psychiatry right now. How do you help severely mentally ill people who cannot consistently care for themselves without repeating the horrors of the asylum era? History shows us two terrifying truths simultaneously. Large institutions can become abusive nightmares, but abandoning vulnerable people to prisons, homelessness, and untreated psychosis is also not humane. And that's the brutal reality nobody has fully been able to solve yet. The institutionalization was not an entire failure, okay? It did end many horrifying institutions, it expanded patients' rights, and it pushed psychiatry towards more humane care. But it also revealed something painfully important. Closing buildings? Oh, that's super easy, but building functioning long term mental health systems is incredibly hard. And when governments fail to build those systems, the fallout does not disappear. It spills directly into things like prisons, shelters, emergency rooms, addiction crisis, and city streets, which means the asylum story never actually ended. It just continues to change locations. Now, before we wrap up, I do want to take a quick minute to talk about some of the people who forced the public to confront what was happening inside of these institutions, because that was never easy to do. I already covered Paul Kenyon, Geraldo Rivera, and Bill Baldini, but they were just part of a much larger chain of reporters, photographers, whistleblowers, and survivors who made the hidden visible. For decades, abuse survived partly because the public didn't know what was going on and they didn't believe patients, but investigative reporters, photographers, and filmmakers changed that by documenting what institutions look like from the inside. And once the camera got through the door, the official story started falling apart very rapidly. In 1887, we have journalist Nellie Bly, who faked mental illness to get herself admitted to Blackwell's Island Insane Asylum. Once inside, she documented freezing baths, rotten food, violent staff, sleep deprivation, medical neglect, and women who were not even mentally ill. What made her reporting so horrifying, though, was not just the cruelty she uncovered, but how quickly the institution was able to erase her credibility. Once the doctor said that she was insane, almost nobody wanted to hear anything different. Bly's work mattered because it exposed a pattern that would repeat for more than a century. Institutions opened with compassionate language and then slid into overcrowding, neglect, secrecy, and abuse. Once reporters started breaking through the secrecy, the official story became much harder to maintain. Next, we have Clifford Beers, and he was not an undercover reporter. He was a former psychiatric patient who turned his own experiences into a devastating critique of the asylum system. In 1908, his memoir, A Mind That Found Itself, described abuse by attendants, beatings, humiliation, neglect, and the way the institution could erase a patient's credibility the moment they were labeled insane. Beers mattered because he exposed the psychiatric abuse as a survivor, and institutions were never comfortable when people they dismissed started documenting what had actually happened. In 1946, we have journalist Albert Maisel, and he published a groundbreaking expose in Life magazine describing psychiatric institutions as snake pits. His reporting and the accompanying photographs showed overcrowded wards, near prison like conditions, severe neglect, poor hygiene, and exhausted staff trying to manage impossible numbers of patients in post war America. The same country that was building shiny suburban neighborhoods was also quietly stuffing mentally ill people into overcrowded human warehouses. Progress apparently was highly selective as a concept. Journalist Albert Deutsch spent years investigating state psychiatric hospitals across the United States, and his reporting described overcrowded wards, starvations, long restraints, violence, understaffing, and the institutions that resembled prisons far more than hospitals. He helped popularize the phrase snake pits, and once readers saw the photos and read the accompanying details, that term no longer felt exaggerated. Instead, it became incredibly accurate. In the 1960s, Burton Blatt secretly photographed conditions inside of institutions for people with developmental disabilities and then published a resulting book called Christmas in Purgatory. It showed children lying naked on floors, overcrowded rooms, restraint practices, severe neglect, and patients left in near catatonic states from chronic understimulation. The pattern running through all of these stories is really hard to miss. Institutions rarely reform themselves voluntarily. Real change only happened after journalists, whistleblowers, photographers, survivors, or undercover investigators forced the public to see what was happening. Systems built around secrecy almost always become more dangerous over time. Modern mental health care is far more humane and evidence based than the asylum era, but this history is still really important because the core danger never fully disappeared. Whenever vulnerable people lose autonomy inside of overloaded systems, abuse and neglect become far easier to justify, and that should make everyone very uncomfortable. And that's why the history of asylums feels so unsettling, though. It's not just a story about old buildings or barbaric treatments or cruel doctors. It's a story about what happens when fear replaces understanding, when institutions value control over care, and when people inside stop being seen as fully human. The walls may look different and the paperwork may be cleaner, but the warning is still the same. I hope you guys enjoyed this deep dive into asylums. I kind of find it fascinating, depressing, but also fascinating. If you guys have any topic suggestions for the future, drop them below in the comment section. Don't forget to like and subscribe, and I'll see you guys soon with another video.